What are churches going to look like after COVID-19, if there ever really is an after COVID-19? I feel like I have an idea based on, some of the information we see coming out there regarding churches and church families, but I want to kind of give you a little bit of a metaphor real quick. In one of the other organizations that I'm really active in Freemasonry, where you need to have a lot of charity work and, people just kind of butting around and, kind of forming fraternal relationships, we were talking about how a lot of these community organizations, Ruritans, Optimists, Moose Club, Elks Club, whatever you want to call it, a lot of these organizations are not nearly what they used to be decades ago. And why is that? Have they done anything wrong? Have they, made some bad changes? And while inside these organizations, constantly you have people saying, well, it's because we don't do this like we used to anymore. We don't do that. The reality is that this is a trend that has really spanned all organizations, churches included, for the past several decades. Without going into all the numbers, I remember doing some research, and across all the different surveys, what came out of this is that you basically have this huge surge and spike in participation in these events following World War II. And people came out of this, largely being in the military and being, community driven, and said, I want to be in these community organizations. Well, people continued, decade in, decade out, through the 50s and the 60s, and, even starting to get into the 70s. And they were joining because their fathers had been in, because their grandfathers had been in. And so people were keeping the tradition alive. It was just something that they did, something they had always done, and it was comfortable. But then at a certain point in time, you hit a generation that had some different ideas. Now, this is not a generational conversation. I'm a millennial, and millennials get beat up all the time, so I'm not about to do that to anybody else. But something happened in the world, in the society, whether it was cultural, whether it was the Vietnam War, whatever you want to call it, and all of a sudden, people who were used to doing something because that's just the way it had always been done, and their parents did and all that, didn't feel like they had that responsibility anymore. I don't have to join just because my father did. I can do my own thing. I'm my own person. So I don't have to do something just because somebody tells me that it has to be done that way. And then eventually they just stop signing up. And because they stop signing up, you end up having many of these organizations languishing today, sitting around in rooms trying to figure out, well, what's the big problem that, we can fix. This is very much what has happened to so many churches in Europe today. You can go into, I know England in particular, but many areas of Europe, and you have these beautiful, gorgeous chapels and churches that are either A, completely empty, or B, have been converted into something else, like a hotel or a restaurant. Now, that wasn't done because the people there weren't good people. It likely didn't happen all across Europe because the people who went there just didn't believe hard enough. It's just at some point in time, that chapel or that church was what it was, and the world around it changed, became more secular, and people stopped coming and they disappeared. Sometimes it's that simple. With COVID-19, it seems like a very similar thing is happening. Something that came out in the Wall Street Journal real quick, it basically says that today we have 63% of people in America identifying as Christian, which doesn't sound terrible until you consider that 14 years ago, so in 2007, 78% of people, so nearly 80% of people said that they were Christian. So you have, nearly this 15% drop off in, the last 14 years in people who identify as Christian. And in that same amount of time, the amount of people who identify as not being religious at all, not having any kind of religion, has gone from 16 to 29%, so almost doubled. So much of this seems to be driven by the fact that, bluntly, people don't feel like they have to do it anymore. As much as we would like to think that every single person who is, in the pews, every single person who shows up to church is there because, oh man, they just love Jesus so much. The reality is that many people do it because that's just kind of what they've always done. Their parents have done it. I've been sitting in meetings where people have just bluntly said, you know what, part of the reason why I'm here is because I like the fact that this makes me feel like I'm more of a part of what my family has done, and so I don't really ever want things to change. And I get it. But the reality is that those organizations are going to last as long as their last generation. And then after that, they'll die off and they'll disappear into obscurity. At best, they can hope to merge with some other organization and maybe carry their tradition along a little bit, but that's it. But coming out of COVID-19, what we're seeing is that churches are not being filled back up. And this is where I get to, something I just put in a devotional and the reason why I wanted to record this video. Your church is not coming back. That's the harsh reality that so many people need to hear. Your church is not coming back. And when I say your church, I mean your church as it was. Your church, given all of the assumptions and constraints that we had placed on it before. And I think that right there is actually the key. It's all the constraints that we place on what we feel a church should be and what we feel a church should be doing. There is a section in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 where Paul talks about needing to be all things to all people. And this key verse that I use all the time when it comes to church and ministry and anything that I'm doing as a pastor is in verse 22, where Paul writes, "To the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I have become all things to all people so that I may by every possible means save some." But then verse 23 goes on to say, "Now I do all this because of the gospel so that I may share in the blessings." Now, the reason why I find that so fascinating and relevant to COVID-19 is because Paul is talking about the need to change, to say the world around you is not going to stop changing. Society is going to change. Technology is going to change. Trends are going to change. The whole idea that we're based on this Judeo-Christian kind of backbone is rapidly changing in our society today. I'm not saying whether that's good or bad or indifferent from a political perspective, but it is a reality that we all have to deal with, whether you like it or not. So if that's the case, we have to be willing to look at our churches and say, are we responding to the calling that God is placing on us wherever we may be? Do we have people that are within a 1 mile, 2 mile, 5 mile radius of our churches that we've considered off limits, that we've said bluntly is not our problem? I mean, I sit here and I think about the apostles and I think about Christ, and I struggle to find a time where any of them ever looked at the people around them and said, that's not my problem. I mean, even the one instance where you could possibly come up with that, where Jesus, tells his disciples in the beginning, like, don't go to the Gentiles. Even there, you see several instances where Christ himself talked to the centurion, several instances where he went into Samaria, areas that were off limits. And so, I guess what you glean from that is that there are no people we're supposed to be holding back the message of Jesus Christ from. There are no people that we should not be offering love and compassion. There aren't groups of people that we could sit here in Calcee, fold our arms and say, well, you know what? They're in that position because they made bad decisions. No, we have to be willing to go out and to meet and love all people, to provide comfort and support to all people, regardless of whether they found themselves in that situation or not. I thank God every single day that he doesn't look at me and say, you know what, I'll give grace to every other person on this earth, but not Joseph, because Joseph knew better and made these decisions. As we come out of COVID-19, we start seeing the entire world around us willing to look at their missions, whether that's school, whether that's sports, whether that's community organizations, and they're willing to say, how do we change and adapt to be able to pursue our mission in this new world? The church must be willing to do the same. We can't do the same thing we've always done and just kind of rely on the momentum of our tradition and past generations. If we lose our evangelical bites, we will end up in the exact same situation as all of the gorgeous, beautiful churches that we see over in Europe. A bunch of buildings that either sit empty or are being repurposed into other things that are willing to change and are willing to meet the needs of the people in the community. That's not a world I want to live in, and it's not a world that I think is going to be something God is going to tolerate. Because what we know of the church is that the gates of hell will not prevail over the Christ church. And if that is the case, God's going to do it with or without us, and I sure would rather God do it with us so that we can be on that journey and so that we too can also enjoy some of the blessings of what God is going to do both in this earth and beyond this earth. Your church is not coming back. It's a harsh reality that has to be acknowledged. And if, as Christians, if all we care about is that the church only stays open as long as we're around to see it, that sure doesn't sound like eternity thinking to me. That sure sounds like something we're doing just because it's tradition, it's habit. And if that's the only reason why we're doing something, it will only last until something else gets in the way. Another shutdown, another pandemic, another global tragedy, and then we'll continue to lose more and more and more people until we shut the church doors. I don't think that's what any of us want. So let's change. Let's figure out how we can adapt, how we can become all things to all people to be able to reach all people in our community. Christ wasn't selective in who he decided to serve, and so I don't see why we should be. So let's go out there, let's adapt, let's overcome. So that at the end of COVID-19, when it's something we're looking at in the rearview mirror, we can say, you know what? The church as we knew it didn't come back, but the church became what it needed to be in order to spread the love of Jesus Christ.